From that frightful smell and that uncanny noise, Willet's attention could no longer be diverted. Both were plainer and more hideous in the great pillared hall than anywhere else, and carried a vague impression of being far below, even in this dark netherworld of subterranean mystery. Before trying any of the black archways for steps leading further down, the doctor cast his beam of light about the stone-flagged floor. It was very loosely paved, and at irregular intervals there would occur a slab curiously pierced by small holes in no definite arrangement, while at one point there lay a very long ladder carelessly flung down. To this ladder, singularly enough, appeared to cling a particularly large amount of the frightful odor which encompassed everything. As he walked slowly about, it suddenly occurred to Willet that both the noise and the odor seemed strongest directly above the oddly pierced slabs, as if they might be crude trap-doors leading down to some still deeper region of horror. Kneeling by one, he worked at it with his hands, and found that with extreme difficulty he could budge it. At his touch, the moaning beneath ascended to a louder key, and only with vast trepidation did he persevere in the lifting of the heavy stone. A stench unnameable now rose up from below, and the doctor's head reeled dizzily as he laid back the slab and turned his torch upon the exposed square yard of gaping blackness. If he had expected a flight of steps to some wide gulf of ultimate abomination, Willet was destined to be disappointed. For amidst that fetor and cracked whining, he discerned only the brick-faced top of a cylindrical well, perhaps 1.5 yards in diameter, and devoid of any ladder or other means of descent. As the light shone down, the wailing changed suddenly to a series of horrible yelps, in conjunction with which there came again that sound of blind, futile scrambling and slippery thumping. The explorer trembled, unwilling even to imagine what noxious thing might be lurking in that abyss, but in a moment mustered up the courage to peer over the rough-hewn brink. Lying at full length and holding the torch downward at arm's length to see what might lie below. For a second he could distinguish nothing but the slimy, moss-grown brick walls sinking illimitably into that half-tangible miasma of murk and foulness and anguished frenzy. And then he saw that something dark was leaping clumsily and frantically up and down at the bottom of the narrow shaft, which must have been from 20 to 25 feet below the stone floor where he lay. The torch shook in his hand, but he looked again to see what manner of living creature might be immured there in the darkness of that unnatural well, left starving by young Ward through all the long month since the doctors had taken him away, and clearly only one of a vast number prisoned in the kindred wells whose pierced stone covers so thickly studded in the floor of the great vaulted cavern. Whatever the things were, they could not lie down in their cramped spaces, but must have crouched and whined and waited and feebly leaped all those hideous weeks since their master had abandoned them unheeded. But Marinus Bicknell Willet was sorry that he had looked again, for surgeon and veteran of the dissecting room though he was, he has not been the same since. It is hard to explain just how a single sight of a tangible object with measurable dimensions could so shake and change a man, and we may only say that there is about certain outlines and entities a power of symbolism and suggestion which acts frightfully on the sensitive thinker's perspective, and whispers terrible hints of obscure cosmic relationships and unnameable realities behind the protective illusions of common vision. In that second look, Willet saw such an outline or entity, for during the next few instants he was undoubtedly as stark mad as any inmate of Dr. Waite's private hospital. He dropped the electric torch from a hand drained of muscular power or nervous coordination, nor heeded the sound of crunching teeth which told of its fate at the bottom of the pit. He screamed and screamed and screamed in a voice whose falsetto panic no acquaintance of his would ever have recognized. And though he could not rise to his feet, He crawled and rolled desperately away over the damp pavement, where dozens of Tartarin wells poured forth their exhausted whining and yelping to answer his own insane cries. He tore his hands on the rough, loose stones, and many times bruised his head against the frequent pillars, but still he kept on. Then at last he slowly came to himself in the utter blackness and stench, and stopped his ears against the droning wail into which the burst of yelping had subsided. He was drenched with perspiration and without means of producing a light, stricken and unnerved in the abysmal blackness and horror, and crushed with a memory he could never efface. Beneath him dozens of those things still lived, and from one of the shafts the cover was removed. He knew that what he had seen could never climb up the slippery walls, yet shuddered at the thought that some obscure foothold might exist. What the thing was, he never could tell. It was like some of the carvings on that hellish altar, but it was alive. Nature had never made it in this form, for it was too palpably unfinished. The deficiencies were of the most surprising sort, and the abnormalities of proportion could not be described. Willett consents only to say that this type of thing must have represented entities which Ward called up from imperfect salts, and which he kept for servile or ritualistic purposes. If it had not had a certain significance, its image would not have been carved on that damnable stone. It was not the worst thing depicted on that stone, but Willett never opened the other pits. At the time, the first connected idea in his mind was an idle paragraph from some of the old Curwen data he had digested long before, a phrase used by Simon or Jedediah Orne in that portentous confiscated letter to the bygone sorcerer. Certainly there was nothing but the liveliest awfulness in that which H. raised up from what he could gather only a part of. Then, horribly supplementing rather than displacing this image, there came a recollection of those ancient lingering rumors anent the burned, twisted thing found in the fields a week after the Curwen raid. Charles Ward had once told the doctors of what old Slocum said of that object, that it was neither thoroughly human nor wholly allied to any animal which Patuxet folk had ever seen or read about. These words hummed in the doctor's mind as he rocked to and fro, squatting on the nitrous stone floor. He tried to drive them out, and repeated the Lord's Prayer to himself, eventually trailing off into a mnemonic hodgepodge like the modernistic wasteland of Mr. T.S. Eliot, and finally reverting to the oft-repeated dual formula he had lately found in Ward's underground library, Yai Niga Niga Yag Satoth, and so on, till the final underlined Zro. It seemed to soothe him, and he staggered to his feet after a time, lamenting bitterly his fright-lost torch, and looking wildly about for any gleam of light in the clutching inkiness of the chilly air. Think he would not, but he strained his eyes in every direction for some faint glint or reflection of the bright illumination he had left in the library. After a while, he thought he detected a suspicion of a glow infinitely far away, and toward this he crawled in agonized caution on hands and knees amidst the stench and howling, always feeling ahead lest he collide with the numerous great pillars or stumble into the abominable pit he had uncovered. Once his shaking fingers touched something which he knew must be the steps leading to the hellish altar, and from this spot he recoiled in loathing. At another time he encountered the pierced slab he had removed, and here his caution became almost pitiful. But he did not come upon the dread aperture after all, nor did anything issue from the aperture to detain him. What had been down there made no sound nor stir. Evidently, its crunching of the fallen electric torch had not been good for it. Each time Willett's fingers felt a perforated slab, he trembled. His passage over it would sometimes increase the groaning below, but generally it would produce no effect at all, since he moved very noiselessly. Several times during his progress, the glow ahead diminished perceptibly, and he realized that the various candles and lamps he had left must be expiring one by one. The thought of being lost in utter darkness, without matches amidst this underground world of nightmare labyrinths, impelled him to rise to his feet and run, which he could safely do now that he had passed the open pit. For he knew that once the light failed, his only hope of rescue and survival would lie in whatever relief party Mr. Ward might send after missing him for a sufficient period. Presently, however, he emerged from the open space into the narrower corridor and definitely located the glow as coming from a door on his right. In a moment he had reached it and was standing once more in young Ward's secret library, trembling with relief and watching the sputterings of that last lamp which had brought him to safety. In another moment he was hastily filling the burned-out lamps from an oil supply he had previously noticed, and when the room was bright again, he looked about to see if he might find a lantern for further exploration. For racked though he was with horror, his sense of grim purpose was still uppermost, and he was firmly determined to leave no stone unturned in his search for the hideous facts behind Charles Ward's bizarre madness. Failing to find a lantern, he chose the smallest of the lamps to carry, also filling his pockets with candles and matches, and taking with him a gallon can of oil which he proposed to keep for reserve use in whatever hidden laboratory he might uncover beyond the terrible open space with its unclean altar and nameless covered wells. To traverse that space again would require his utmost fortitude, but he knew it must be done. Fortunately, neither the frightful altar nor the opened shaft was near the vast cell-indented wall which bounded the cavern area, and whose black, mysterious archways would form the next goals of a logical search. So Willett went back to that great pillared hall of stench and anguished howling, turning down his lamp to avoid any distant glimpse of the hellish altar or of the uncovered pit with the pierced stone slab beside it. Most of the black doorways led merely to small chambers, some vacant and some evidently used as storerooms, and in several of the latter he saw some very curious accumulations of various objects. One was packed with rotting and dust-draped bales of spare clothing, and the explorer thrilled when he saw that it was unmistakably the clothing of a century and a half before. In another room he found numerous odds and ends of modern clothing, as if gradual provisions were being made to equip a large body of men. But what he disliked most of all were the huge copper vats which occasionally appeared. These and the sinister incrustations upon them. He liked them even less than the weirdly figured leaden bowls, whose rims retained such obnoxious deposits, and around which clung repellent odors perceptible above even the general noisomeness of the crypt. When he had completed about half the entire circuit of the wall, he found another corridor like that from which he had come, and out of which many doors opened. This he proceeded to investigate, and after entering 3 rooms of medium size and of no significant contents, he came at last to a large oblong apartment, whose business-like tanks and tables, furnaces and modern instruments, occasional books and endless shelves of jars and bottles, proclaimed it indeed the long-sought laboratory of Charles Ward, and no doubt of old Joseph Curwen before him. After lighting the 3 lamps which he found filled and ready, Dr. Willett examined the place and all its appurtenances with the keenest interest, noting from the relative quantities of various reagents on the shelves that young Ward's dominant concern must have been with some branch of organic chemistry. On the whole, little could be learned from the scientific ensemble, which included a gruesome-looking dissecting table, so that the room was really rather a disappointment. Among the books was a tattered old copy of Borellus in black letter, and it was weirdly interesting to note that Ward had underlined the same passage whose marking had so perturbed good Mr. Merritt at Curwen's farmhouse more than a century and a half before. That older copy, of course, must have perished along with the rest of Curwen's occult library in the final raid. 3 archways opened off the laboratory, and these the doctor proceeded to sample in turn. From his cursory survey, he saw that 2 led merely to small storerooms, but these he canvassed with care, remarking the piles of coffins in various stages of damage, and shuddering violently at 2 or 3 of the few coffin plates he could decipher. There was much clothing also stored in these rooms, and several new and tightly nailed boxes which he did not stop to investigate. Most interesting of all, perhaps, were some odd bits which he judged to be fragments of old Joseph Curwen's laboratory appliances. These had suffered damage at the hands of the raiders, but were still partly recognizable as the chemical paraphernalia of the Georgian period. The third archway led to a very sizable chamber, entirely lined with shelves, and having in the center a table bearing 2 lamps. These lamps Willett lighted, and in their brilliant glow studied the endless shelving which surrounded him. Some of the upper levels were wholly vacant, but most of the space was filled with small, odd-looking leaden jars of 2 general types. One tall and without handles, like a Grecian lakithos, or oil jug, and the other with a single handle and proportioned like a phaleron jug. All had metal stoppers and were covered with peculiar-looking symbols molded in low relief. In a moment the doctor noticed that these jugs were classified with great rigidity, all the lakithoi being on one side of the room with a large wooden sign reading Custodes above them, and all the phalerons on the other, correspondingly labeled with a sign reading Materia. Each of the jars or jugs, except some on the upper shelves that turned out to be vacant, bore a cardboard tag with a number, apparently referring to a catalogue, and Willett resolved to look for the latter presently. For the moment, however, he was more interested in the nature of the array as a whole, and experimentally opened several of the lakithoi and phalerons at random with a view to a rough generalization. The result was invariable. Both types of jars contained a small quantity of a single kind of substance, a fine dusty powder of very light weight and of many shades of dull neutral color. To the colors, which formed the only point of variation, there was no apparent method of disposal, and no distinction between what occurred in the lakithoi and what occurred in the phalerons. A bluish-gray powder might be by the side of a pinkish-white one, and any one in a phaleron might have its exact counterpart in a lakithos. The most individual feature about the powders was their non-adhesiveness. Willett would pour one into his hand, and upon returning it to its jug, would find that no residue whatever remained on its palm. The meaning of the 2 signs puzzled him, and he wondered why this battery of chemicals was separated so radically from those in glass jars on the shelves of the laboratory proper. Custodes, Materia. That was Latin for guards and materials, respectively. And then there came a flash of memory as to where he had seen that word guards before in connection with this dreadful mystery. It was, of course, in the recent letter to Dr. Allen, purporting to be from old Edward Hutchinson, and the phrase had read, "There was no need to keep the guards in shape and eating off their heads, and it made much to be found in case of trouble, as you too well know." What did this signify? But wait, was there not still another reference to guards in this matter which he had failed wholly to recall when reading the Hutchinson letter? Back in the old non-secretive days, Ward had told him of the Eleazar Smith diary, recording the spying of Smith and Whedon on the Curwen farm, and in that dreadful chronicle there had been a mention of conversations overheard before the old wizard betook himself wholly beneath the earth. There had been, Smith and Whedon insisted, terrible colloquies wherein figured Curwen, certain captives of his, and the guards of those captives. Those guards, according to Hutchinson or his avatar, had eaten their heads off, so that now Dr. Allen did not keep them in shape. And if not in shape, how save as the salts to which it appeared this wizard band was engaged in reducing as many human bodies or skeletons as they could? So that was what these lakithoi contained, the monstrous fruit of unhallowed rites and deeds, presumably won or cowed to such submission as to help, when called up by some hellish incantation, in the defense of their blasphemous master, or of the questioning of those who were not so willing. Willett shuddered at the thought of what had been pouring in and out of his hands, and for a moment felt an impulse to flee in panic from that cavern of hideous shelves with their silent and perhaps watching sentinels. Then he thought of the materia in the myriad Phaleron jugs on the other side of the room. Salts too, and if not the salts of guards, then the salts of what? God, could it be possible that here lay the mortal relics of half the Titan thinkers of all the ages, snatched by the supreme ghouls from crypts where the world thought them safe, and subject to the beck and call of madmen who sought to drain their knowledge for some still wilder end whose ultimate effect would concern, as poor Charles has hinted in his frantic note, all civilization, all natural law, perhaps even the fate of the solar system and the universe. And Marinus Bicknell Willett had sifted their dust through his hands. Then he noticed a small door at the farther end of the room, and calmed himself enough to approach it and examine the crude sign chiseled above. It was only a symbol, but it filled him with vague spiritual dread, for a morbid, dreaming friend of his had once drawn it on paper and told him a few of the things it means in the dark abyss of sleep. It was the sign of Koth, that dreamers see fixed above the archway of a certain black tower, standing alone in twilight, and Willett did not like what his friend Randolph Carter had said of its powers. But a moment later he forgot the sign as he recognized a new acrid odor in the stench-filled air. This was a chemical rather than an animal smell, and came clearly from the room beyond the door. And it was, unmistakably, the same odor which had saturated Charles Ward's clothing on the day the doctors had taken him away. So it was here that the youth had been interrupted by the final summons. He was wiser than old Joseph Curwen, for he had not resisted. Willett, boldly determined to penetrate every wonder and nightmare this nether realm might contain, seized the small lamp and crossed the threshold. A wave of nameless fright rolled out to meet him, but he yielded to no whim and deferred to no intuition. There was nothing alive here to harm him, and he would not be stayed in his piercing of the eldritch cloud which engulfed his patient. The room beyond the door was of medium size and had no furniture save a table, a single chair, and two groups of curious machines with clamps and wheels, which Willett recognized after a moment as medieval instruments of torture. On one side of the door stood a rack of savage whips, above which were some shelves bearing empty rows of shallow pedestaled cups of lead, shaped like Grecian kilikes. On the other side was the table with a powerful Argand lamp, a pad and pencil, and two of the stoppered lakythoi from the shelves outside, set down at irregular places as if temporarily or in haste. Willett lighted the lamp and looked carefully at the pad to see what notes young Ward might have been jotting down when interrupted, but found nothing more intelligible than the following disjointed fragments in that crabbed Curwen chirography, which shed no light on the case as a whole. B. died not, escaped into walls, and found place below. Saw old V. Say ye Sabaoth, and learnt ye way. Raised Yog Sothoth thrice, and was he next day delivered. F. sought to wipe out, all knowing how to raise those from outside. As the strong Argand blaze lit up the entire chamber, the doctor saw that the wall opposite the door, between the two groups of torturing appliances in the corners, was covered with pegs from which hung a set of shapeless-looking robes of a rather dismal yellowish white. But far more interesting were the two vacant walls, both of which were thickly covered with mystic symbols and formulae, roughly chiseled in the smooth-dressed stone. The damp floor also bore marks of carving, and with but little difficulty Willett deciphered a huge pentagram in the center, with a plain circle about 3 feet wide, halfway between this and each corner. In one of these 4 circles, near where a yellowish robe had been flung carelessly down, there stood a shallow calyx of the sort found on the shelves above the whip-rack, and just outside the periphery was one of the Phaleron jugs from the shelves in the other room, its tag numbered 118. This was unstoppered and proved upon inspection to be empty. but the explorer saw with a shiver that the calyx was not. Within its shallow area, and saved from scattering only by the absence of wind in the sequestered cavern, lay a small amount of a dry, dull greenish efflorescent powder, which must have belonged in the jug, and Willett almost reeled at the implications that came sweeping over him as he correlated little by little the several elements and antecedents of the scene. The whips and the instruments of torture, the dust or salts from the jug of materia, the two leucethoi from the custodes shelf, the robes, the formulae on the walls, the notes on the pad, the hints from letters and legends, and the thousand glimpses, doubts, and suppositions which had come to torment the friends and parents of Charles Ward. All these engulfed the doctor in a tidal wave of horror as he looked at that dry greenish powder outspread in the pedestaled leaden calyx on the floor. With an effort, however, Willett pulled himself together and began studying the formulae chiseled on the walls. From the stained and encrusted letters, it was obvious that they were carved in Joseph Curwen's time, and their text was such as to be vaguely familiar to one who had read much Curwen material or delved extensively into the history of magic. One the doctor clearly recognized as what Mrs. Ward heard the son chanting on that ominous Good Friday a year before, and what an authority had told him was a very terrible invocation addressed to secret gods outside the normal spheres. It was not spelled here exactly as Mrs. Ward had set it down from memory, nor yet as the authority had shown it to him in the forbidden pages of Eliphas Levi, but its identity was unmistakable, and such words as Sabaoth, Metatron, Almusin, and Zariat Notmek sent a shudder of fright through the searcher who had seen and felt so much of cosmic abomination just around the corner. This was on the left-hand wall as one entered the room. The right-hand wall was no less thickly inscribed, and Willett felt a start of recognition as he came upon the pair of formulae so frequently occurring in the recent notes in the library. They were, roughly speaking, the same, with the ancient symbols of dragon's head and dragon's tail heading them as in Ward's scribblings. But the spelling differed quite widely from that of the modern versions, as if old Curwen had had a different way of recording sound, or as if later study had evolved more powerful and perfected variants of the invocations in question. The doctor tried to reconcile the chiseled version with the one which still ran persistently in his head, and found it hard to do. Where the script he had memorized began Yai Nung Naga Yag Satoth, this epigraph started out as I Engenga Yaga Satotha, which to his mind would seriously interfere with the syllabification of the second word. Ground as the later text was into his consciousness, the discrepancy disturbed him, and he found himself chanting the first of the formulae aloud in an effort to square the sound he conceived with the letters he found carved. Weird and menacing in that abyss of antique blasphemy rang his voice, its accents keyed to a droning sing-song either through the spell of the past and the unknown, or through the hellish example of that dull godless wail from the pits, whose inhuman cadences rose and fell rhythmically in the distance through the stench and the darkness. Yai Nga, Yag Satoth, Hil Geb, Vai Throdag, Wah! But what was this cold wind which had sprung into life at the very outset of the chant? The lamps were sputtering woefully, and the gloom grew so dense that the letters on the wall nearly faded from sight. There was smoke, too, and an acrid odor which quite drowned out the stench from the faraway wells, an odor like that he had smelt before, yet infinitely stronger and more pungent. He turned from the inscriptions to face the room with its bizarre contents, and saw that the calyx on the floor, in which the ominous efflorescent powder had lain, was giving forth a cloud of thick, greenish-black vapor of surprising volume and opacity. That powder, great God, it had come from the shelf of materia. What was it doing now, and what had started it? The formula he had been chanting, the first of the pair, dragon's head, ascending node, blessed Savior, could it be? The doctor reeled. and through his head raced wildly disjointed scraps from all he had seen, heard, and read of the frightful case of Joseph Curwen and Charles Dexter Ward. I say to you again, do not call up any that you cannot put down. Have ye words for laying at all times ready, and stop not to be sure when there is any doubt of whom you have. 3 talks with what was therein inhumed. Mercy of heaven, what is that shape behind the parting smoke?